I want now to talk about the kinds of minds that we need in the future. So, globalization. Imagine with me megacities like Sao Paulo or Mexico City, where millions and millions of people have to live together, work, find ways of dealing with one another, even if they are of very different backgrounds. Think about brands which travel around the world, fast food chains, movies, automobiles, clothing. So these are all examples of globalization, the movement of money, customs, and populations. The second feature is the biological revolution. Every month we're learning more about the brain. Every month we're learning more about genetics. And that information is going to affect education in very powerful ways. In your lifetime, students will come to school with a picture of their brain, a functional MRI, and a gene chip with their own unique genome, and they will say to teachers, "Teach me in a way that I can learn." And if the teachers cannot make sense of the brain image or the gene chip, then education will become a medical specialty because, of course, doctors and scientists are trained to read about the brain and to read about genetics. And already, and this is something I study, we can tell very early in life if a child is going to have reading problems, if the child is at risk for dyslexia, and we're beginning to know what kind of treatment will work for what kind of language problem. And the same thing will happen with each of the intelligences. So the biological revolution will have enormous impact in education, though only in the most specialized settings is it evident at the present time. The third revolution is the digital revolution. Computers, the World Wide Web, the Internet, all of these things are already beginning to have impact in education. And it's a situation, very unusual, where young people are much more sophisticated than older people. We distinguish between digital immigrants, which are most of you, and your children who are digital natives, and I'm a digital paleolith, but I'm trying to study and understand the new digital media because those are also huge changes that are occurring in our society. One other one I will mention is lifelong learning. In my grandparents' generation, most people didn't have even a secondary school education. In my parents' generation, most people didn't have to learn once they finished secondary school or the university. Now, of course, education everywhere has to be lifelong. And so not only do we need to know how we can continue to learn, but thank goodness we now know the brain is able to acquire new information for many, many years after adolescence. So now I'm going to introduce 5 Minds for the Future, which is a book that was recently published in English and also in Portuguese and Spanish. But in fact, this is not a book about psychology. It's not a book about the brain. It's a book about policy. What are the kinds of minds that we need to develop in the 21st century? So the first mind, next slide, is the disciplined mind. The disciplined mind. And the disciplined mind has three different connotations. First of all, discipline means working steadily at things and getting better. The second sense of discipline is to master the major ways of thinking that human beings have developed in the last few thousand years. Thinking mathematically, artistically, scientifically, historically. By the time young people finish secondary school, the traditional view of intelligence goes back about 100 years, and it consists of a number of points. First of all, intelligence is a single thing. Psychologists use the English letter G to describe general intelligence. Intelligence is highly heritable. That means it's carried in the human genes. So if you know how smart your parents are, or even better, if you know how smart your grandparents are, you can predict how smart you will be. Since it's part of the human genome, you can't do much about it. You are stuck with your general intelligence. Everybody needs to be an expert in at least one thing. An expert artist, or craftsperson, or professional. Because if you're not a professional expert, either you will not have a job, or you will work for somebody else who's an expert. Because anything that can be automated will be automated. Many jobs which existed even 25 years ago are done as well or better by computers than they are by human beings. So it's extremely important for everyone to be disciplined enough to master a discipline if he or she wants to succeed in the 21st century. The second mind, prossimo, is the synthesizing mind. And I think this is the most interesting mind. It's the one that I've thought the most about. Today, everybody is inundated, overwhelmed by information. Anything that you look up on the internet, you could spend the rest of your life reading about that topic and going to all the links. So the synthesizing mind has many jobs. It has to decide what to pay attention to and what to ignore, and it needs criteria for making that separation. The synthesizing mind has to put together material so you can hold on to it. If you can't organize it in a way that makes sense to you, you will forget it. And if you are in the business of communicating, as a teacher or as a worker, you need to be able to convey your synthesis to other people. Now, in a way, educators have always had to synthesize. But we haven't really been mindful, reflective about how we do it. But in the 21st century, we need to understand our synthesizing well enough so that we can help students become better synthesizers. And that means you need to have criteria for judging syntheses, because not every synthesis is good, just like every textbook is not good. So you need to have the criteria to judge: is the synthesis balanced? Is it too broad? Is it too narrow? Is it eccentric in some way? And I thought that my field of psychology would have answers to this question, but it doesn't. So the challenge of understanding how we synthesize and being able to do it well, I think, will characterize the 21st century. The third kind of mind is the creating mind. This is the mind that goes beyond discipline, beyond synthesis, and explores the unknown, asks new questions, comes up with new puzzles, proposes new solutions. In English, we talk about thinking outside the box. The creating mind thinks outside the box. But you cannot think outside the box unless you have a box. And the box is the discipline and the synthesizing. Because if you don't have a box, you might come up with something new, but probably you will just reinvent the wheel. The trick, the secret, is to learn the discipline and the synthesizing when you're young. Because then there's more time to think outside the box. As you get older, the box gets more and more congealed, sclerotic. It's more difficult to change. And so creativity is easier when you've mastered the discipline, but the discipline hasn't become a blinder that hides outside the box. The two other minds have less to do with cognition in the usual sense and more to do with how we relate to other human beings. They are the respectful mind and the ethical mind. Próximo. The respectful mind is easy to explain, but difficult to achieve. The respectful mind begins with a recognition that people are very different from one another. We look different, we have different beliefs, different tastes, and so on. It takes diversity as a fact of life. Now, when people are different from you, you can kill them, or they can kill you. You can tolerate them, which is better than intolerance. But the respectful mind tries to understand other people, tries to work with them, tries to make a positive out of human differences. From infancy, children can tell whether their environment is respectful. How do parents treat one another? How do children treat one another? When you go to school, how do teachers treat the staff, treat parents, treat children? Respect is quite manifest. It's easy to see, but it's not easy to achieve, and much of the world is characterized by disrespect. In fact, I don't know about Brazilian television, but if it's anything like US television, it's filled with examples of disrespect, people putting down other people and not trying to understand them. There are lots of examples of disrespect. When you're nice to people who have more power, but you are nasty to people who have less power. When you tell jokes which are at the expense of groups. When you respect other people, but you have a whole set of conditions, and if they don't meet those conditions, then you don't respect them. This doesn't mean that we should respect Adolf Hitler, but it does mean we should give people a second chance. The next slide suggests that there are ways to bring about respect when it hasn't existed. There are political ways, commissions on peace and reconciliation, which try to bring together groups that were in conflict. There are efforts in music, in the arts, in athletics, to have teams from different countries cooperate rather than fight. And I don't know much about the history of Brazil, but I think that Brazil has an advantage over most countries in that diversity is so much a part of your history and is so much a part of your population that you've already learned a lot. The comparison with Western Europe is very stark, because until 50 years ago, the population of each Western European country was quite homogeneous. France for French, Germans for German, and so on. Now, of course, Western Europe is filled with people from East Europe, from the former Soviet Union, from the Mediterranean, from North Africa, from the Far East. And as you probably know, European countries have a much more difficult time dealing with this diversity than places like the United States or Brazil, which have had a very diverse population for centuries. The final mind is the ethical mind, and it's somewhat more difficult to explain than the respectful mind, and it's also the one that I've been working on for the last 15 years. Respect, as I say, begins in infancy, and every infant can see if the people in the community respect one another. Ethics requires abstraction, the ability to step outside of yourself as a person and to think of yourself as a worker and as a citizen. So, I'm Howard Gardner, and from an early age, I could see whether people respected one another, and you could see whether I was respectful of them, and vice versa. But only as I became an adolescent could I think of myself as a worker, in this case as a scholar or teacher, and as a citizen of my community, of my country, and increasingly we are all citizens of the planet. We live in a global time, and whether it's advertisements or diseases or global warming, all these phenomena affect the whole planet. People who are ethical think about what is the right thing for them to do in their job and what is the right thing for them to do as citizens. And it's not enough to think about what the right thing is. Of course, you have to do the right thing. So, many of you are educators. It's easy to talk about what your rights are as your educator, but what are your responsibilities? What are the right things you should do when it comes to a case of cheating or a case where your boss tells you one thing but you don't think it's good for students, or if parents come in and try to pressure you one way or the other? Ethical means, what does it mean to be a teacher? What does it mean to be a physician? What does it mean to be a lawyer or judge? That's what ethics is. And you are all citizens. Most of you are citizens of Porto Alegre, of the state, of the nation, the Brazilian nation. I guess you're also citizens of Mercosur, but more importantly, you're citizens of the planet. And again, human rights are wonderful, but what are your responsibilities? What are your responsibilities for the environment? What are your responsibilities for voting? If you're sick, should you go on an airplane? If you have swine flu or H1N1, what are your responsibilities as a citizen? So the ethical mind thinks about what's the right thing to do, not just what's good for you for your own personal self-interest.